When Walter arrived at the hotel that morning, he thought it would be just another day of cleaning floors and keeping things in order. But then he encountered Victoria, the wife of the hotel owner, storming through the lobby, her eyes fixed on him with disdain. As their paths crossed, Walter felt the sharp sting of humiliation when she cruelly stomped on his hand, treating him as if he was less than nothing. What Victoria didn't know was that her every word and action was being watched closely by a man whose presence would soon turn her world upside down. David, Walter's son. Little did she realize her world was about to change forever. Before we dive into this intense story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're as captivated by this emotional journey as we are, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The Grand Majestic Hotel stood as a beacon of luxury in the heart of the city. Its opulent lobby, adorned with crystal chandeliers and marble floors, buzzed with the quiet hum of high society. The soft notes of a grand piano wafted through the air, mingling with the clink of champagne glasses and hushed conversations of the elite. In this world of extravagance, Walter, the elderly janitor, moved with purpose. His weathered hands gripped a mop, methodically wiping away the remnants of a champagne spill. Despite his aged appearance, there was an undeniable dignity in his movements, a quiet pride in his work that seemed to elevate even the most mundane tasks. As Walter worked, a young bellhop passed by, offering a respectful nod. "Evening, Mr. Walter," he said softly. Walter looked up, a gentle smile creasing his face. "Good evening, Tommy. Busy night?" "Always is, sir, but it's better with you around," Tommy replied, his words genuine. This brief exchange didn't go unnoticed. A concierge at the front desk watched the interaction, a fond smile playing on her lips. It was clear that Walter was more than just a janitor to the staff. He was a respected presence, a calming force in the often chaotic world of luxury hospitality. As Walter resumed his work, the grand doors of the hotel swung open, announcing the arrival of Victoria Thompson, wife of the hotel's owner. Her entrance was like a sudden gust of wind, disrupting the calm atmosphere of the lobby. Draped in designer clothing and dripping with jewels, Victoria's eyes darted around the room, scrutinizing every detail as if searching for imperfections. Her gaze fell upon a young waitress who was carefully balancing a tray of champagne flutes. "You there," Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "That tray is smudged. Do you think our guests want to drink from dirty glasses?" The waitress stammered an apology, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Victoria's lips curled into a smirk, seemingly satisfied with the effect of her words. She continued her march across the lobby, her high heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to impending doom. Walter, still focused on his task, didn't notice Victoria's approach until it was almost too late. As she neared the area he was cleaning, her foot hovered dangerously close to the wet surface. Walter's eyes widened in alarm. "Ma'am, please be careful," he began, but his warning came a moment too late. Victoria's heel touched the damp floor, causing her to stumble slightly. She let out an exaggerated gasp, more for the benefit of onlookers than from any real danger. Her eyes, filled with indignation, locked onto Walter. "You!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the lobby. "What do you think you're doing, leaving the floor in this state? Are you trying to injure someone?" Walter straightened up, his face a picture of genuine concern. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Thompson. I was just finishing up here. Are you all right?" But Victoria wasn't interested in his apology or his concern. Her voice rose even higher, drawing the attention of everyone in the vicinity. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't cut it. Do you have any idea who I am? I could have been seriously hurt." Walter tried again to apologize, his voice soft and placating. "I assure you, ma'am, I was being as careful as possible. I always put out wet floor signs." "Silence." Victoria cut him off mid-sentence, her face contorted with rage. "I don't want to hear your excuses. How do you talk back to me? Do you know how lucky you are to even have a job like this?" The lobby had fallen silent, all eyes now fixed on the unfolding scene. Hotel guests watched with a mix of discomfort and morbid fascination. The staff, who moments ago had been going about their duties, now stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Victoria, emboldened by the attention, continued her tirade. "Look at you," she sneered, eyeing Walter's uniform with disgust. "At your age, you should be grateful anyone would hire you at all. And this is how you repay that kindness? By endangering the lives of our guests?" Walter's shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of her words, but he maintained his composure. "Mrs. Thompson, I assure you, safety is my top priority. I would never intentionally put anyone at risk." But Victoria was far from finished. Her voice dripped with venom as she spat out her next words. "Priority? Huh. The only priority I see is your utter incompetence. Move faster, old man, or are you too slow and decrepit to do even this simple job properly?" Walter, his face a mask of calm despite the humiliation, knelt to gather his cleaning supplies. He moved carefully, trying to complete his task while enduring Victoria's verbal onslaught. It was at this moment that Victoria's cruelty reached its peak. As Walter reached for his mop, Victoria deliberately stepped forward, the pointed heel of her red designer shoe coming down hard on Walter's outstretched hand. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Walter's face contorted in pain, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he remained silent, his eyes closed as he endured the cruel act. Victoria looked down at him, a smug expression on her face. She seemed to relish in his pain, making no move to lift her foot. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "aren't you going to move? Or do you enjoy being underfoot? I suppose people in your position should be used to hardship." The lobby was deathly quiet now. The piano had stopped, its final notes hanging in the air like an unfinished question. Hotel guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. A few made as if to step forward, but uncertainty held them back. The staff's reaction was even more telling. A young receptionist's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The concierge who had smiled at Walter earlier now stood rigid, her fists clenched at her sides. Even Tommy, the friendly bellhop, looked on with a pained expression, clearly torn between his respect for Walter and his fear of Victoria's wrath. As Walter kneeled before Victoria, feeling every ounce of the humiliation, his mind drifted back to the long and winding path that had led him to this point in his life. His mind stirring up memories from decades past, each one a testament to his unwavering spirit and dedication to his family. In his mind's eye, Walter saw himself as a young man, barely out of his teens, standing in front of a rickety old house. It was nothing much to look at, with its peeling paint and creaky porch, but to Walter and his new bride, Sarah, it was the beginning of their dream. They had scraped together every penny they had to make the down payment, and as they stood there, keys in hand, Walter made a silent vow to give his family the life they deserved. The scene shifted, and Walter found himself juggling multiple jobs. By day, he worked as a construction worker, his hands calloused and his back aching from the physical labor. As soon as his shift ended, he'd rush to his night job as a security guard at a local warehouse. The hours were long and the work was grueling, but Walter never complained. Each paycheck brought him one step closer to providing for his growing family. Another memory surfaced, this one of Walter sitting at their small kitchen table, surrounded by his children. David, their eldest, was just starting school, while his younger siblings, Emily and Michael, watched with wide-eyed curiosity. Walter was helping David with his homework, patiently explaining each problem. "Remember, son," Walter said, his voice gentle but firm, "it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about understanding how you got there. That's the real lesson." David nodded, his young face scrunched up in concentration. "I think I get it, Dad. Can we try another one?" Walter smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course we can. We got all the time in the world." The scene melted away, replaced by another. This time, Walter was standing in the backyard with his children, teaching them how to plant a small vegetable garden. His hands, already showing signs of years of hard work, guided theirs as they carefully placed seeds in the soil. "You see," Walter explained, "this garden is like life. You get out what you put in. If you nurture it, care for it, and work hard, you'll reap the rewards. But it takes patience and dedication." Emily looked up at her father, her eyes shining. Will we really be able to eat the vegetables we grow, Dad? Walter chuckled. We sure will, sweetheart. And they'll taste all the better because we grew them ourselves. As the years passed in Walter's memories, the challenges grew. There were times when money was tight, when the bills piled up and the future seemed uncertain. But through it all, Walter's resolve never wavered. He took on extra shifts, learned new skills, and always made sure his family had what they needed. One particular memory stood out, a conversation with David, who was now a teenager. They were sitting on the front porch, the same one Walter had repaired countless times over the years. Dad, David said, his voice hesitant, some of the kids at school, they make fun of me because of my old clothes and our beat-up car. Walter put his arm around his son's shoulders. David, listen to me. The things we own don't define us. What matters is who we are, how we treat others, and the effort we put into bettering ourselves and the world around us. Those kids might have newer things, but do they have the satisfaction of earning them? Do they understand the value of hard work and perseverance? David looked up at his father, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. I think I get it, Dad, and I'm proud of you, of us, of what we have. Walter smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. I'm proud of you too, son. More than you know. As the memories faded, Walter found himself back in the present, kneeling before a woman who might not even understand the true value of hard work or the love, respect, and the fruits of honest labor. And that, Walter knew, was worth more than any luxury money could buy. Meanwhile, across town in a sleek, modern office building, David Walter was in the midst of closing a high-stakes business deal. Gone was the uncertain teenager of Walter's memories, replaced by a confident, successful businessman. Yet, beneath the tailored suit and polished exterior, the values his father had instilled in him remained intact. So, Mr. Walter, said the man sitting across from David, do we have a deal? David leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. Almost, Mr. Harrington. But before we sign, I'd like to discuss the clause about employee benefits one more time. Mr. Harrington's eyebrows rose. Is there a problem? I thought we had agreed on all the terms. No problem, David assured him. I just want to make sure we're providing the best possible support for our workers. After all, they're the backbone of this merger. Without their hard work and dedication, neither of our companies would be where they are today. For a moment, Mr. Harrington looked surprised. Then his expression softened. You know, David, in all my years of business, I've rarely met someone in your position who cares so much about the little guy. It's refreshing. David's smile widened. Thank you, sir. I learned from the best. Now, shall we take another look at those benefits? As they pored over the documents, David's assistant knocked on the door. Excuse me, Mr. Walter. Your car is ready to take you to your meeting at the Grand Majestic Hotel. David nodded, checking his watch. Perfect timing. Mr. Harrington, I believe we've ironed out all the details. Shall we sign? After exchanging signatures and handshakes, David gathered his things and headed out. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The merger would not only boost the company's profits but also secure better working conditions for hundreds of employees. It was the kind of win-win situation his father had always taught him to strive for. The drive to the Grand Majestic Hotel was short, giving David just enough time to review his notes for the upcoming meeting. As his car pulled up to the hotel's grand entrance, he straightened his tie and took a deep breath. Another big deal was on the horizon, and he was ready to tackle it head-on. As David stepped into the hotel lobby, the opulent surroundings momentarily took his breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, their light reflecting off polished marble floors. Well-dressed guests milled about, their quiet conversations creating a low hum of activity. But something was off. There was a tension in the air, an uneasiness that seemed at odds with the luxurious setting. David's eyes scanned the lobby, trying to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. And then he saw it, a scene that made his blood run cold. There, in the center of the lobby, was his father. Walter, still in his janitor's uniform, was on his knees, a pained expression on his face. Standing over him was a woman David didn't recognize, her expensive clothes and haughty demeanor marking her as someone of importance in the hotel. And was she stepping on his father's hand? For a moment, David stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then, as the woman's shrill voice cut through the air, berating his father in front of everyone, something inside David snapped. His calm demeanor evaporated, replaced by a tightly controlled anger that radiated from every pore. His jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides, and his eyes, usually warm and friendly, turned to steel. With measured steps, David began to move towards the scene. He barely noticed the other hotel guests, some of whom were watching the altercation with a mix of shock and morbid fascination. His focus was entirely on his father and the woman who was humiliating him. As he drew closer, David could hear the woman's words more clearly. "Should be grateful anyone would hire you at all. And this is how you repay that kindness? By endangering the lives of our guests?" David's anger threatened to boil over, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. His father had always taught him the importance of keeping a level head, even in the most challenging situations. He wouldn't let his anger cloud his judgment now. Instead of confronting the woman directly, David turned to the nearest hotel staff member, a young bellhop who was watching the scene with a look of distress. "Excuse me," David said, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge that demanded attention. "What's going on here? Why is no one intervening?" The bellhop, startled by David's sudden appearance, stammered out a response. I'm sorry, sir. That's Mrs. Thompson, the owner's wife. We can't." David's eyes narrowed. "You can't what? Stand up for a fellow employee who's being mistreated? Is this how your hotel treats its staff?" The young man's face paled, and he looked down, unable to meet David's intense gaze. "It's not that simple, sir. Mrs. Thompson, she has a lot of influence. We could lose our jobs if we—" David cut him off, his voice sharp. "And that makes it okay to stand by and watch as she abuses an elderly man? Is that the kind of establishment this is?" By now, David's confrontation with the bellhop had drawn the attention of other staff members. A concierge approached cautiously, her face a mask of professional concern. "Sir," she said, her voice low and placating, "I understand your concern, but I assure you, we have protocols in place for handling situations like this. Perhaps if you'd like to speak with our manager." David turned to face her, his expression unyielding. "Protocols? Is publicly humiliating and physically hurting an employee part of your protocols? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your protocols involve turning a blind eye to blatant abuse." The concierge's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing a mix of shame and fear. "Sir, please understand, Mrs. Thompson is, well, she's not someone we can simply— Not someone you can what?" David pressed, his voice rising slightly. "Not someone you can hold accountable for her actions? Not someone you can expect basic human decency from?" By now, a small crowd of staff members had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly torn between their fear of Mrs. Thompson and their growing unease with the situation. A senior-looking staff member, perhaps a manager, stepped forward. "Sir, I apologize for any distress this situation may have caused you. I assure you, we take the well-being of our staff very seriously. If you'd like to file a formal complaint—" David let out a humorless laugh. "A formal complaint? While that man is still being berated and abused? No, what I'd like is to see anyone show some backbone and put a stop to this disgraceful display." The manager's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and indignation. "Sir, I must ask you to lower your voice. You're causing a scene." "I'm causing a scene?" David's voice was incredulous. "There's a woman over there stepping on an elderly man's hand, and I'm the one causing a scene?" The staff members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding David's gaze. Their silence spoke volumes, revealing a deep-seated fear of crossing Mrs. Thompson, even in the face of such blatant mistreatment. David took another deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He looked each staff member in the eye, his gaze a mix of disappointment and challenge. "I understand you're afraid. I get that your jobs might be on the line. But at what cost? At what point do you say enough is enough?" A young woman, her name tag identifying her as a receptionist, spoke up hesitantly. We We all respect Walter, sir. He's kind to everyone, always ready to help. But Mrs. Thompson, she has a temper. And her husband owns the hotel. We can't just—" David's expression softened slightly at the mention of his father's name. "So you know him. You know he doesn't deserve this treatment. And yet you stand here, making excuses instead of helping him." The staff members looked at each other, shame evident on their faces. The manager stepped forward again, his voice low and urgent. "Sir, please. We're not heartless, but you have to understand our position. Mrs. Thompson can make our lives very difficult if we cross her. Some of us have families to support, mortgages to pay." David held up a hand, cutting him off. "I understand that. Believe me, I do. But let me ask you this. If it were you on your knees, being humiliated in front of everyone, wouldn't you want someone to stand up for you? To say that this isn't right, regardless of the consequences?" A heavy silence fell over the group. David could see the conflict playing out on their faces, the desire to do the right thing warring with their fear of repercussions. Finally, the young bellhop who had first spoken to David stepped forward. His voice was shaky, but there was determination in his eyes. "You're right, sir. This isn't right. Walter's always been good to us. He doesn't deserve this. I'm going to say something." As the young man turned to move towards Walter and Mrs. Thompson, David placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "Thank you," he said softly. "But I'll handle this. You've shown real courage just by being willing to act." With that, David turned back towards the center of the lobby, where his father was still enduring Mrs. Thompson's tirade. His anger was replaced by a steely resolve. He knew that what he was about to do could have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, but for his father and everyone involved. But as he looked at Walter, his father, the man who had sacrificed so much, who had taught him the value of hard work and integrity, David knew there was only one course of action. With steady steps, he began to move towards Mrs. Thompson, ready to confront her and put an end to this humiliating spectacle. As he approached, David could hear Mrs. Thompson's voice more clearly. Her words were dripping with disdain, each syllable a verbal lash against his father's dignity. But what struck David most was Walter's demeanor. Despite the pain and humiliation, his father had expression of quiet dignity. It was this sight, his father, the epitome of strength and resilience in the face of cruelty, that steeled David's resolve. He quickened his pace, his presence commanding attention as he drew near. "Excuse me," David's voice cut through Mrs. Thompson's tirade like a knife. "I believe that's enough." Mrs. Thompson whirled around, her face a mask of indignation at being interrupted. "And who do you think you are?" she spat, her eyes raking over David's expensive suit with a mix of curiosity and disdain. David met her gaze unflinchingly. "My name is David Walter," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "And I believe you're mistreating this man." For a moment, Mrs. Thompson seemed taken aback by David's direct approach. Then her eyes narrowed. "And how is this any of your business?" "Of course, it is wide business, Mrs. Thompson," David replied, his tone level. "The man you're currently abusing, he's my father." A hush fell over the lobby. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in shock, darting between David and Walter as if seeing them for the first time. Walter, for his part, looked up at his son with a mix of surprise and quiet pride. Your father?" Mrs. Thompson stammered, her composure cracking. But that's impossible. He's just a—" "And what, Mrs. Thompson?" David interjected, his voice sharp. "A janitor? A hard-working man who's dedicated years of his life to keeping this hotel running smoothly? A human being deserving of basic respect and dignity." Mrs. Thompson took a step back, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected turn of events. I didn't know," she muttered, her earlier bravado evaporating. David took a step closer, his presence imposing despite his controlled demeanor. "And would it have mattered if you did know? Is this how you treat all your employees, or just the ones you think can't fight back?" By now, a crowd had gathered around them. Hotel guests watched with rapt attention, while the staff hovered nervously on the periphery, unsure of how to react to this unprecedented confrontation. I was just—" Mrs. Thompson began, but David cut her off. You were just what? Asserting your authority? Showing everyone how important you are by belittling someone you saw as beneath you? David's voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of his anger and disappointment. He turned to address the onlookers, his voice rising slightly to ensure everyone could hear. Is this the kind of establishment the Grand Majestic Hotel wants to be? One where employees are publicly humiliated and abused? Where basic human dignity is trampled on for the sake of someone's ego? The crowd murmured in response to David's words, a mixture of agreement and discomfort rippling through the gathered onlookers. Mrs. Thompson, her face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger, seemed to shrink under the weight of the collective gaze. David turned back to Mrs. Thompson, his eyes blazing with determination. Let me make something perfectly clear, he said, his voice low, but carrying easily in the hushed lobby. If this is how the Grand Majestic Hotel treats its employees, then I want no part of it. I'll be canceling all my business with this establishment, effective immediately. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Even Walter looked up at his son in surprise. But more than that, David continued, his voice gaining strength, I'll be sure to let all my business associates know exactly why I'm no longer patronizing this hotel. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about the treatment of staff here. Mrs. Thompson's face paled at these words. She seemed to suddenly realize the full implications of her actions and the potential consequences. Now, Mr. Walter, she said, her voice trembling slightly, surely we can discuss this reasonably. There's no need for such drastic measures. David's expression remained unyielding. Reasonable? Was it reasonable to publicly humiliate a man who has dedicated years of his life to this hotel? Was it reasonable to physically harm him? He shook his head. No, Mrs. Thompson. I think we're well past the point of reasonable discussion. He turned to address the crowd once more. I want everyone here to understand something. No amount of wealth, no fancy title or position gives anyone the right to treat another human being this way. My father taught me that the measure of a person isn't in their bank account or their social status, but in how they treat others, especially those they perceive as beneath them. David's words seemed to resonate with many in the crowd. Several guests nodded in agreement, while some of the staff members stood a little straighter, a spark of something like hope in their eyes. So here's my ultimatum, David announced, his voice ringing with finality. Either this hotel makes immediate and significant changes to how it treats its employees, or I walk. And I take my business, my connections, and my influence with me. The weight of David's words hung in the air. Mrs. Thompson, who had been trying to interrupt, fell silent, her face a mask of panic. Mr. Walter, she said, her voice now almost pleading, please, can we discuss this privately? I'm sure we can come to some sort of understanding. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. But David remained unmoved by her sudden change in demeanor. A misunderstanding? He repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. No, Mrs. Thompson. What happened here was very clear. There's nothing to misunderstand about cruelty and abuse of power. Mrs. Thompson's composure crumbled entirely. You don't understand, she stammered, her words tumbling out in a rush. I was just having a bad day. I didn't mean to. I would never intentionally. Please, you have to believe me. But David remained steadfast. Your intentions are irrelevant, Mrs. Thompson. Your actions speak for themselves. And they speak volumes about the culture of this hotel and the values it represents, or rather, the lack thereof. He turned to his father, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of pride and concern. Dad, David said, his voice softening, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? Walter shook his head, a small smile on his face despite the circumstances. I'm all right, son. Nothing I can't handle. Suddenly, the grand doors of the hotel burst open with a thunderous bang. All heads turned to see a tall, imposing figure striding into the lobby. Mr. Thompson, Victoria's husband and the owner of the Grand Majestic, had arrived. His presence was like a storm sweeping through the room. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed back, Mr. Thompson exuded an aura of power and authority. His steel-gray eyes scanned the lobby, taking in every detail of the scene before him. As he approached, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path between him and Victoria. She stood there, her earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by a look of growing dread. "Richard," Victoria began, her voice trembling slightly. "I can explain," but Mr. Thompson held up a hand, silencing her instantly. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over the assembled crowd once more before settling on his wife. "Victoria," he said, his voice low, but carrying easily in the hushed lobby. "What have you done?" Before Victoria could respond, Mr. Thompson turned to address the onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests of the Grand Majestic, I must offer my sincerest apologies for the disgraceful scene you've witnessed today. I assure you, this is not representative of our establishment or its values." Victoria's face paled even further. She had expected her husband to defend her, to smooth things over with his usual charm and diplomacy. But as she watched him address the crowd, she realized with growing horror that she was about to become the sacrificial lamb. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice growing harder. "The Grand Majestic has always prided itself on providing not just luxury, but also warmth and respect to all who pass through our doors, be they guests or staff. What occurred here today was a betrayal of those principles." He turned back to Victoria, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "Victoria, your behavior today has been nothing short of appalling. You have embarrassed not just yourself, but this entire establishment and everything it stands for." Victoria flinched as if she'd been physically struck. "Richard, please," she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. "Can't we discuss this in private?" But Mr. Thompson shrugged off her touch, his voice rising as he continued to berate her publicly. "Private? No, Victoria. You chose to make a public spectacle of yourself and this hotel. You'll face the consequences just as publicly." The assembled crowd watched in stunned silence. Staff members who had cowered under Victoria's wrath earlier now looked on with a mix of shock and, in some cases, poorly concealed satisfaction. "Do you have any idea of the damage you've caused?" Mr. Thompson demanded, his voice echoing through the lobby. "Years of building this hotel's reputation, cultivating relationships with high-profile clients, and you've jeopardized it all with your petty cruelty." Victoria's eyes darted around frantically, seeking any ally or escape from this public humiliation. But she found no sympathy in the faces surrounding her. Even those who had once fawned over her now watched her downfall with detached curiosity. "Richard," she tried again, her voice cracking, "please, let's go to your office. We can sort this out." "Sort what out, Victoria?" Mr. Thompson cut her off sharply. "The fact that you physically assaulted an employee? That you humiliated a man who's given years of loyal service to this hotel? Or perhaps you'd like to sort out how you've potentially cost us one of our most valuable clients." Victoria's face crumpled at these words. She reached out, grabbing her husband's sleeve desperately. "Please," she whispered urgently, "not here. Not like this. Think of our reputation." But Mr. Thompson merely looked down at her hand on his sleeve with disdain before brushing it off. "Our reputation?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, I'm thinking of our reputation, Victoria. I'm thinking of how your actions have tarnished it, and how I need to salvage what's left." He turned back to address the crowd once more. "I want to assure everyone here that what you've witnessed today is an anomaly. The Grand Majestic has always valued each and every one of its employees, recognizing that their hard work and dedication are the true foundations of our success." As Mr. Thompson spoke, Victoria seemed to shrink into herself. Her earlier haughty demeanor had vanished entirely, replaced by a look of utter defeat. She made one last, desperate attempt to get her husband to stop, tugging at his sleeve and whispering urgently, "Richard, please, you're humiliating me." But Mr. Thompson merely shook her off, not even bothering to look at her as he continued addressing the onlookers. "The incident that occurred here today goes against everything we stand for. I assure you, it will not go unaddressed." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Walter and David. Mr. Thompson's expression hardened as he locked eyes with David. "Mr. Walter," he said, his voice carrying a note of forced politeness. "I understand that you and your father were the victims of this unfortunate incident. On behalf of the Grand Majestic, and myself personally, I offer my deepest apologies." David's face remained impassive, but he nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Mr. Thompson then turned to Victoria, his expression stern and unyielding. "Victoria," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you will apologize to Mr. Walter and his father." "Now?" Victoria's eyes widened in disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but one look at her husband's face told her it would be futile. Tears welling up in her eyes, she turned to face Walter and David. I'm sorry," she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. "My behavior was unacceptable. It won't happen again." The apology rang hollow in the vast lobby, Victoria's insincerity evident in every stammered word. David's expression remained unchanged, his eyes cold as he regarded Victoria. Walter, however, showed a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it pity? Mr. Thompson, apparently unsatisfied with Victoria's performance, spoke up again. "I don't think they heard you, Victoria. Louder, if you please." Victoria flinched at her husband's harsh tone, but complied. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice stronger but cracking with emotion. "What I did was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you that way, Mr. Walter. I apologize for any distress I may have caused you. It won't happen again." As Victoria finished her forced apology, a heavy silence fell over the lobby. David, his face still a mask of controlled anger, opened his mouth to speak. But before he could, Walter gently placed a hand on his son's arm. "David," Walter said softly, his voice carrying easily in the hushed lobby. "Let it go, son." David turned to his father, surprise evident on his face. "Let it go," he repeated incredulously. "After what she did to you? After how they've treated you?" Walter nodded, a small, sad smile on his face. "Yes, son, holding on to anger, it only hurts us in the end. We've made our point. Now it's time to move on." David stared at his father for a long moment, clearly struggling with the idea. His eyes flicked back to Victoria, who stood trembling under her husband's stern gaze, then to Mr. Thompson, whose calculating eyes were fixed on him. Finally, David let out a long, slow breath. "You're a better man than I am, Dad," he said softly. Then, addressing Mr. Thompson and Victoria, he spoke in a clear, firm voice. "We accept your apology, Mrs. Thompson. But understand this. Acceptance doesn't mean forgetting. The way you treat your employees, the culture you foster in this hotel, it needs to change." Mr. Thompson nodded gravely. "I assure you, Mr. Thompson, changes will be made. The Grand Majestic values all its employees, and what happened today was an unfortunate aberration." David held Mr. Thompson's gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. "See that it is," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Because if I ever hear of anything like this happening again, our business relationship will be permanently terminated." With that, David gently took his father's arm. "Come on, Dad, let's go home." As David and Walter made their way out of the lobby, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Guests retreated to their rooms. Staff members hurried back to their posts, all eager to escape the lingering tension. Victoria stood rooted to the spot, her face a mask of humiliation and shock. Mr. Thompson, without sparing her another glance, addressed the remaining staff. "Back to work, everyone. We have a hotel to run." As the lobby slowly returned to its normal state of quiet luxury, Victoria found herself alone, the center of attention one moment and utterly ignored the next. She watched as her husband strode away, already engaged in damage control with the hotel manager. In that moment, surrounded by the opulence she had always taken for granted, Victoria felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The realization dawned on her that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been the architect of her own unhappiness all along. As the last echoes of the confrontation faded away, the Grand Majestic Hotel settled into an uneasy calm. But beneath the surface, change was brewing. The events of that day had set in motion a chain reaction that would transform not just the hotel, but the lives of everyone involved, Victoria included. For Victoria, the public berating by her husband was a watershed moment. As she stood there, the last remnants of her composure crumbling away, she felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. The world she had known, the power she had wielded so carelessly, suddenly seemed as fragile as spun glass. She watched as the last of the onlookers dispersed, their whispers and sidelong glances cutting her more deeply than she would have thought possible. The staff, who had once jumped at her every command, now hurried past with averted eyes, as if afraid her disgrace might be contagious. Victoria's mind raced, replaying the events that had led to this moment. How had things spiraled so far out of control? She had only been asserting her authority, hadn't she? Maintaining the standards of the hotel? But even as these justifications flitted through her mind, she knew they rang hollow. The image of Walter's dignified silence in the face of her cruelty haunted her. And David's fierce defense of his father, the disappointment and anger in his eyes. It stirred something in Victoria that she had long thought buried shame. As the reality of her situation sank in, Victoria felt a wave of panic rising within her. She had always defined herself by her position, her status as the wife of the hotel's owner. But now, publicly humiliated and clearly dispensable in her husband's eyes, who was she? Her eyes darted around the lobby, seeking out Richard. He stood near the front desk, deep in conversation with the hotel manager. His back was to her, a clear message that she was not a priority in this moment of crisis. Taking a deep breath, Victoria smoothed down her designer dress and tried to compose herself. She had to fix this, had to regain control somehow. With faltering steps, she approached her husband. "Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about this. Please, can we go somewhere private?" Mr. Thompson turned, fixing her with a cold stare that made her flinch. "I'm busy dealing with your mess, Victoria. We'll talk later." "But Richard," she persisted, desperation creeping into her voice, "I can explain. It wasn't as bad as it looked. If you just listen." "Enough!" Mr. Thompson's sharp tone cut through her words like a knife. "I said we'll discuss this later. Now, if you have any concern for what's left of this hotel's reputation, you'll make yourself scarce." Victoria recoiled as if she'd been slapped. Never in all their years of marriage had Richard spoken to her like this, at least not in public. She opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her cold. Swallowing hard, Victoria nodded and turned away. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her as she made her way across the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor with each defeated step. As she reached the elevator, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished doors. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, her carefully applied makeup smeared, her eyes red-rimmed, her posture slumped in a way that would have horrified her just hours ago. Was this what she had become? Was this all she was without her position and power? As the elevator doors closed, shutting her away from the scene of her downfall, Victoria felt the last of her composure crumble. Tears began to fall, streaking her cheeks with mascara. She leaned against the wall of the elevator, her body racked with silent sobs. By the time she reached the penthouse suite, Victoria had managed to regain some semblance of control. She moved through the opulent rooms on autopilot, shedding her jewelry and kicking off her shoes. Sinking onto the plush sofa, Victoria stared out at the city skyline without really seeing it. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger at being humiliated, fear of the consequences, and underneath it all, a growing sense of shame that she couldn't quite shake. For the first time in years, Victoria found herself questioning everything. Had she always been this person? This cruel, dismissive woman who could so casually hurt others? Or had she become this way gradually, seduced by power and status until she'd lost sight of her own humanity? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the luxurious suite, Victoria remained motionless. She knew that soon Richard would return. There would be consequences to face, explanations demanded. But for now, in this moment of solitude, she allowed herself to confront the harsh truths she had long ignored. The woman she saw reflected in the window was not someone she liked very much. And as this realization settled over her, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, the desire to change. Meanwhile, across town, David and Walter had finally arrived home. The modest house was a far cry from the grandeur of the Grand Majestic, but as they stepped inside, both men felt a sense of relief wash over them. Walter sank into his favorite armchair with a weary sigh. "What a day," he murmured, shaking his head slightly. David paced the small living room, the tension still evident in every line of his body. "I can't believe you wanted to let them off the hook, Dad," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "After what that woman did to you." Walter looked up at his son, a small smile playing on his lips. "And what good would holding on to that anger do, David? Would it change what happened? Would it make me feel any better?" David stopped his pacing, turning to face his father. "It's not about feeling better, Dad. It's about justice. It's about making sure they can't treat people like that anymore." "And you think your anger would accomplish that?" Walter asked gently. "Or did your words, your actions, make more of an impact?" David opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. I can't stand the thought of anyone treating you like that, Dad. You deserve so much better." Walter leaned forward, his eyes meeting his son's. "David, listen to me. What happened today, it wasn't about me. Not really. That woman, Mrs. Thompson, she's unhappy. Deeply unhappy. People who are content with themselves don't lash out at others like that." David shook his head in disbelief. "How can you be so understanding, so forgiving?" Walter smiled, a lifetime of wisdom in his eyes. "Because I've lived long enough to know that holding on to anger and resentment only poisons your own soul. Forgiveness isn't about excusing their actions, David. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of hatred." For a long moment, David was silent, absorbing his father's words. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I don't know if I can be that forgiving, Dad, but I'll try. For you." Walter reached out, patting his son's knee. "That's all anyone can ask, son. To try. And who knows? Maybe today's events will lead to some real changes at that hotel." Sometimes, it takes a shock to the system to make people reevaluate their actions. As the evening wore on, father and son talked, their conversation moving beyond the events of the day to memories of the past and hopes for the future. The warm glow of the living room lamp cast a comforting light over them, a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescence of the hotel lobby. David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Dad, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "I think it's time for you to retire." Walter looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Retire? But David, I'm still capable of working. The hotel needs me, Dash." "The hotel doesn't deserve you, Dad," David interrupted softly. "You've done more than enough for our family, for everyone. It's time to rest, to enjoy life without the daily grind." Walter's brow furrowed, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I don't know, son. Work has been my life for so long. What would I do with myself?" David smiled, reaching out to clasp his father's shoulder. "You'd live, Dad. Travel, read all those books you never had time for. Spend more time with Mom and the grandkids. You've earned it." For a long moment, Walter was silent, his eyes distant as he contemplated his son's words. Finally, he let out a long sigh. "You're right, David. It's time. But I want to say goodbye properly to the people I've worked with all these years." David nodded, understanding the importance of closure for his father. "Of course, Dad. We'll do it right." The next day, word spread quickly through the Grand Majestic about Walter's retirement. Despite the tumultuous events of the previous day, or perhaps because of them, staff members and even some guests who had witnessed the incident gathered in the lobby to bid Walter farewell. As Walter walked through the grand doors for the last time as an employee, he was met with a sea of familiar faces. The young bellhop, Tommy, stepped forward first, his eyes shining with emotion. "Mr. Walter," he said, his voice thick, "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything you've taught me, for always being kind. This place won't be the same without you." One by one, staff members came forward to shake Walter's hand, share a memory, or simply nod in respect. Even some of the regular guests joined in, expressing their appreciation for Walter's years of quiet dignified service. As the impromptu gathering began to disperse, David stood beside his father, watching the scene with a mix of pride and protectiveness. He turned to Walter, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Dad, I want you to know something," he said, meeting his father's eyes. "Everything you've taught me, every value you've instilled, I promise to honor and protect them. Your legacy of hard work, dignity, and respect, it won't end here. It'll live on through me, through everything I do." Walter's eyes misted over, and he clasped his son's hand tightly. "I know it will, son. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." Together, Walter and David walked out of the Grand Majestic Hotel for the last time. The sunlight streaming through the grand entrance seemed to illuminate Walter, highlighting the dignity that had always been his hallmark. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Walter paused, turning to look back at the building that had been such a significant part of his life. A wistful smile played on his lips, tinged with both nostalgia and anticipation for the future. "Ready, Dad?" David asked gently. Walter nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Ready, son. Let's go home." As they walked away, Walter's hand resting on his son's arm, the scene captured the bittersweet end of one chapter and the promising beginning of another. Walter was leaving behind years of dedicated service, but he was walking towards a future filled with the love and respect he had earned through a lifetime of integrity. The days following the incident at the Grand Majestic Hotel passed in a blur for Victoria Thompson. She found herself confined to the penthouse suite, avoiding the whispers and sidelong glances from the staff. Her husband, Richard, had barely spoken 2 words to her since his public berating in the lobby. One evening, as Victoria sat alone in the expansive living room, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her seemed like a stranger, perfectly coiffed hair, designer clothes, and a face etched with lines of discontent. For the first time in years, Victoria truly looked at herself, and what she saw made her heart sink. "Is this all there is?" she whispered to her reflection. "Is this what I've become?" The emptiness of her relationship with Richard and the shallow pursuit of wealth that had dictated her life for so long suddenly felt suffocating. The memory of Walter's dignified silence in the face of her cruelty haunted her, a stark contrast to her own behavior. Victoria's mind wandered to the early days of her marriage to Richard. They had been young, ambitious, and in love, or so she had thought. But somewhere along the way, the pursuit of status and wealth had overshadowed everything else. Their relationship had devolved into a business arrangement, each playing their part in maintaining the illusion of success. With a heavy sigh, Victoria stood up and walked to the bedroom. Richard was already asleep, his back turned to her side of the bed. As she looked at him, she realized that she felt nothing, no love, no warmth, not even anger. Just emptiness. In that moment, Victoria made a decision that would change the course of her life. The next morning, Richard found a note on Victoria's pillow. It was short and to the point. "Richard, I'm leaving. I can't live this life anymore. I'll be filing for divorce. Victoria." Within days, Victoria had moved out of the penthouse and into a small, modest apartment on the other side of the city. The transition was jarring, to say the least. Gone were the luxurious furnishings, the army of staff catering to her every whim, and the cushion of wealth that had insulated her from the realities of everyday life. Her first week in the new apartment was a series of humbling experiences. She struggled with simple tasks like doing laundry and cooking meals. The grocery store became a bewildering maze of choices and prices she had never had to consider before. One afternoon, as Victoria fumbled with her wallet at the checkout counter, the cashier, a kind-faced older woman, gently helped her count out the correct change. "First time managing your own money, dear?" the woman asked, her voice free of judgment. Victoria felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Is it that obvious?" The cashier smiled warmly. "We all start somewhere. You'll get the hang of it." As Victoria left the store, those simple words of encouragement stuck with her. She realized that this was the first genuine interaction she'd had with someone in years. No pretense, no power dynamic, just human kindness. Over the following weeks, Victoria slowly adapted to her new life. She learned to navigate public transportation, clip coupons, and find joy in small, everyday victories. The struggles she faced without the luxury she once knew were challenging, but they also awakened something in her that had long been dormant: empathy. One rainy evening, as Victoria hurried home from her part-time job at a local bookstore, she passed a homeless man huddled in a doorway. In her old life, she would have walked by without a second glance. But now she stopped. "Excuse me," she said softly, reaching into her bag. "Would you like my umbrella? And maybe we could get you something warm to eat?" The man looked up, surprise and gratitude filling his eyes. "Thank you, miss. That's very kind of you." As they shared a simple meal at a nearby diner, Victoria listened to the man's story. His name was Frank, and a series of misfortunes had left him on the streets. For the first time in her life, Victoria truly listened to someone else's struggles, and she felt her heart open in a way it never had before. Months passed, and Victoria's transformation continued. She volunteered at a local soup kitchen, made friends with her neighbors, and found a sense of purpose she had never known in her life of luxury. The woman who had once looked down on others now found joy in lifting them up. But despite her growth, there was still a weight on Victoria's conscience. The memory of her treatment of Walter, the kind janitor at the Grand Majestic. She knew that to truly move forward, she needed to make amends. It took some effort, but Victoria finally managed to track down Walter's address. On a crisp autumn afternoon, she found herself standing on the porch of a modest suburban home, her heart pounding as she rang the doorbell. The door opened, and there stood Walter, his kind eyes widening in surprise as he recognized her. "Mrs. Thompson?" he said, his voice tinged with confusion. Victoria swallowed hard. "Hello, Mr. Walter. I was hoping we could talk, if that's all right with you." Walter hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Of course. Please come in." As Victoria entered the cozy living room, she was struck by the warmth of the home. Family photos lined the walls, and the air smelled of freshly baked cookies. It was everything her lavish penthouse had never been: a true home. Walter gestured for her to sit on the sofa while he settled into an armchair across from her. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked gently. Victoria took a deep breath. "First, please call me Victoria. And I came here to apologize. Truly apologize." She looked into Walter's eyes, her own filling with tears. "What I did to you that day at the hotel was inexcusable. I was cruel, arrogant, and completely wrong. I treated you as if you were beneath me, when in reality, you possess a dignity and strength of character that I could only hope to achieve." Walter listened silently, his expression softening as Victoria continued. "That day, it opened my eyes to the person I had become. I didn't like what I saw, Mr. Walter. Since then, I've left my old life behind. I've been trying to become a better person, to understand the struggles of others, to find meaning beyond wealth and status." Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "I want to thank you, Mr. Walter. Your dignified response to my cruelty, it sparked a change in me. I know I can never undo the hurt I caused you, but I hope you can forgive me. And I want you to know that you've made a profound impact on my life." As Victoria finished speaking, a tear rolled down her cheek. She waited, her heart pounding, for Walter's response. Walter leaned forward, his eyes kind but searching. "Victoria," he said softly, "thank you for coming here today. Your apology means a great deal to me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You know, in all my years, I've learned that everyone deserves a second chance to become a better person. It's never too late to change, to grow, to learn from our mistakes." Victoria nodded, wiping away a tear. "I'm trying, Mr. Walter. Every day, I'm trying to be better." Walter smiled warmly. "And that, Victoria, is what matters most. The fact that you're here, that you've taken steps to change your life, that shows true strength of character." Walter placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Victoria, every day is a new opportunity to be the person you want to be. Keep moving forward, keep growing, and never forget the lessons you've learned." As Victoria stood to leave, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She turned to Walter one last time. Mr. Walter, I don't suppose. Would it be all right if I came by the soup kitchen sometime? To volunteer? Walter's face lit up with a warm smile. I think that would be wonderful, Victoria. They can always use an extra pair of hands. As Victoria walked down the path from Walter's house, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet, and the crisp air filled her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, truly present in the moment. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from the heights of luxury to the humbling experiences of everyday life. The path hadn't been easy, but as she reflected on the person she was becoming, Victoria knew that she wouldn't trade this new life for all the wealth in the world. As she reached the sidewalk, Victoria turned back to look at Walter's house one last time. She saw him standing in the doorway, giving her a small wave. She waved back, a genuine smile spreading across her face. In that moment, Victoria made a silent vow to herself. She would continue on this path of growth and compassion. She would strive every day to be the kind of person who lifted others up instead of tearing them down. And she would never forget the lesson she had learned from the kind janitor who had shown her the true meaning of dignity and forgiveness. As Victoria walked away, the setting sun cast long shadows across the suburban street. But for Victoria, it felt like a new dawn, the beginning of a life filled with purpose, empathy, and genuine human connection. Back in his living room, Walter sat in his favorite armchair, a thoughtful expression on his face. He picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hello," came David's voice on the other end. "David, it's Dad," Walter said warmly. "You'll never guess who just came by the house." As Walter recounted Victoria's visit and her transformation, David listened in stunned silence. When his father finished, David let out a low whistle. "Well, David said. "I never thought I'd see the day." "Do you really believe she's changed, Dad?" Walter chuckled softly. "You know, son, in all my years, I've learned that people can surprise you. Victoria's taken some big steps. Only time will tell if the change is lasting. But I believe she's sincere." David was quiet for a moment. "You're a better man than me, Dad. I don't know if I could forgive so easily." "It's not about being better, David," Walter replied gently. "It's about understanding that we're all capable of change. Remember what I told you about forgiveness? That it's not about excusing their actions, but freeing yourself from the burden of hatred," David recited, a smile in his voice. "I remember, Dad. You've taught me well." As the evening wore on, Walter and David's conversation drifted to other topics: family news, David's work, plans for the upcoming holidays. But underlying it all was a sense of gratitude for the lessons they had learned and the bonds that had been strengthened through adversity. When they finally said their goodbyes, Walter sat back in his chair, a peaceful smile on his face. He thought about the twists and turns of life, how a single moment could set in motion a chain of events that could change everything. From his position of retirement, Walter could look back on his years of work with pride. He had always believed in the dignity of hard work, in treating others with respect regardless of their position. Now, seeing how those values had impacted not only his son, but even someone like Victoria, Walter felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As the night settled in, Walter picked up a book from the side table, a retirement gift from his colleagues at the hotel. As he opened it, a note fell out. It was from Tommy, the young bellhop. "Mr. Walter, thank you for everything you've taught me. Your kindness and dignity have shown me what it means to be a true professional and a good person. I'll never forget the lessons I've learned from you. Enjoy your retirement. You've more than earned it, Tom." Walter smiled as he read the note, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. This, he thought, was the true measure of a life well lived, not in wealth or status, but in the lives touched and the values passed on. As he settled in to read, Walter felt grateful for the journey that had brought him to this point. From his years of hard work to the dramatic events at the hotel, from seeing his son stand up for what was right to witnessing Victoria's transformation, every step had reinforced his belief in the power of kindness, dignity, and forgiveness. The soft ticking of the clock and the rustle of pages filled the quiet room as Walter read, content in the knowledge that the values he held dear would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he might never know. Outside, the world continued to turn. At the Grand Majestic Hotel, changes were being implemented, inspired by the events surrounding Walter's departure. In her small apartment across town, Victoria was planning her first shift at the soup kitchen, nervous but excited to continue her journey of growth. And in homes across the city, countless others went about their lives, each carrying their own stories of struggle, triumph, and transformation. In the grand tapestry of life, Walter's story, and the lives he had touched, was but a single thread. But it was a thread that shimmered with the light of compassion, integrity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to change and grow. As the night deepened, Walter closed his book and prepared for bed. Tomorrow was a new day, full of possibilities. And though he was retired, Walter knew that his work, the work of spreading kindness and dignity, would never truly be done. With a contented sigh, he turned out the light, grateful for the life he had lived and the legacy he had created. In the quiet of the night, the lessons learned and the changes made continued to resonate, a testament to the profound impact one person's dignity and kindness could have on the world around them. Walter's decision to forgive Victoria in the face of her cruelty not only helped her see the flaws in her own character, but also transformed her life for the better. It's a powerful reminder that kindness and forgiveness can create a ripple effect that changes lives in unexpected ways. What would you have done if you were in Walter's or David's place? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more heartfelt tales like this one.